yesterday we have been discussing about Lebesgue integration, and finally we were able to introduce integration of a complex function. So let us recall the definition of Lebesgue integral. So I think I'm audible, right?
Yes.
Okay. So you start from a complex measurable function on some sigma algebra, some measure space, so f from x to z. Then every complex function you can write it as f1 plus I into f2, where f1 and f2 are real functions. That is straightforward. So now, if you are able to introduce integral of real functions, then for complex functions you can define it in this way. So integral of this complex function is integral of its real part plus I into integral of its imaginary part. Simple. Now you should keep in your mind that so now it suffices to know what does this mean. I mean, whenever f1 is a real valued function or maybe extended real valued function. So in this situation we have defined it in this way. I mean, every extended real valued function you can write it as a difference of two non-negative functions, f plus and f minus, where f plus is the maximum of f0 and f minus is the minus of minimum of f0. So both f plus and f minus are non-negative functions. So if we know the definition for integral of non-negative functions, then for extended real value function you can define it in this way. So integral of f plus minus integral of f minus. And for non-negative real valued functions, we have already introduced this using the approximation by symbol functions. So let us simply recall that definition. Yeah. So this is the definition. So for symbol functions, you define it in this way. Symbol function can be written as a linear combination of characteristic functions, summation alpha I k ai. So integral is naturally defined as summation alpha I mu of en. Now, for non-negative functions, you take the supremum of all integral of the symbol functions, where the supremum is taken over all symbol functions lying between 0 and f. And you know why this makes sense, because we already have a sequence of symbol functions which is monotonically increasing to f. And using that, we have proved monotone convergence theorem. And monotone convergence theorem will help us to prove that the linearity of the integral. That means integral of f plus g is integral f plus integral g. This is possible. So these are the things which we have seen yesterday. Now we are going to see a very important another convergence theorem known as Lebesgue dominated convergence theorem. So before going to that, let me introduce the space. We'll come to this. So when you start from a complex measurable function, when we have this condition is satisfied, that means integral of the absolute value of f is finite, then we say that f is in L1 mu. In fact, we will modify this definition a little bit later. Now what we do, we define for absolute, so this is known as absolutely integrable functions. So for f and g in L1 mu, you can actually obtain this. This is straightforward now, because integral alpha f plus beta g is alpha into integral f plus beta into integral g. Remember that now we have complex measurable functions, but we have already proved this linearity for non-negative functions. And this definition comes from that non-negative functions. So this is simple substitution and obtaining this. Okay. So this will give you the linearity of the integral. Okay. This I leave it to you verify. And another very important inequality, this is known as Jensen's inequality. So it tells you that, in fact, this inequality is more or less familiar to all of you. Absolute value of the integral f d mu is bounded by integral of absolute value. So when you take absolute value function inside, you have this inequality. So in fact, Jensen inequality is valid for any convex function. You can, instead of absolute value function, you can replace by any convex function. Let us see the proof. Okay. So let us write z equal to integral f d mu. You know that this is a complex number. This integral f d mu is a complex number. So you write it as z, and every complex number you have a polar representation, right? So I guess all of you are familiar with this, right? Polar representation, yes or no?
Yes, sir.
So you can write z as absolute value of z into exponential I into argument of z. That's what polar representation. But this argument is the, argument is a multi-valued function, which is, we can take it as an angle between angle from z to the positive real axis. It can be a multiple. It is a multi-valued function, but you can take principal argument if you want. So this is the way in which you can write it. I will not use all those things. I will just use this representation. And this tells you that absolute value of z is z into e raised to minus I arc z. And now you put alpha equal to e raised to minus I arc z. Okay? Then absolute value of alpha is 1 because exponential power something is on the unit circle. Now real part of alpha f is always bounded by absolute value of alpha f. These are simple complex analysis, basic complex number things. And absolute value of alpha into f is absolute value of f because of this. Now you start from mod z. Mod z is integral over x f d mu. Now we know that mod z is z e raised to I arc z. And this is what we denoted by alpha. So this is alpha z. So alpha into integral f d mu. Now by the property of the integral, you can take this alpha inside. So this is integral alpha f d mu. And remember that the left hand side is a non-negative quantity. Therefore, the right hand side also should be non-negative. Therefore, this integral coincides with the integral of its real part because all the things are real only. So here you have real alpha f. Now, this is equal to real alpha f. Now the real alpha f is bounded by absolute value of alpha f. So we have this inequality because f less than or equal to g implies integral f less than or equal to integral g. This is something we observed here last week. So now here absolute value of alpha is 1. Therefore this is equal to this. So we get this inequality. So are you convinced with the proof? Any question regarding this proof? Any question? Any doubt? No, yes or no? Are you okay with this? Not comfortable?
Sir, z equal to integral x f d mu. It's okay. Then we wrote that since z is a complex number, it can be written in the exponential form mod z into e raised to I argument z. After that step, mod z equal to z e raised to minus.
That is simply you are taking this here. So you have minus. Just divide by.
Clear, sir.
This part to the left hand side. That's all.
Okay. Clear, sir.
Then, what about the remaining part? Okay. So now we have all the tools ready to prove the well-known Lebesgue dominated convergence theorem. So what does it mean? You start from a sequence of complex measurable functions, and you consider fn converges to f pointwise. Okay. And let me comment here that note that in fact this result is also true even this happens only in a set in the set except in a set of measure 0. I mean even if this is not true in a set of measure 0, then also our result is true. I mean as far as measure theory is concerned, what happens in a set of measure 0 is not going to influence anything. So fx is equal to limit fn x. So now you have an additional assumption. This is why it is called a dominated theorem, because you demand that this fn is dominated by some L1 function. So there exists an G in L1 mu such that absolute value of Fn is bounded by G. Okay. Now our conclusions: F is in L1 mu, and you have this limit n tends to infinity, absolute value of integral of f, absolute value of Fn minus F goes to 0. Or in other words, this will imply that integral Fn converges to integral F. That means Fn converges to F implies integral Fn converges to integral F. That means you can interchange the limit and integral. Remember, we have only point-wise convergence here. So this means eradicates some of the limitations of our Riemann integration here. Okay. So I guess the statement is clear to you. Now the proof is very easy in this sense. You have mod Fn less than or equal to G. So if you apply limit, mod F will be less than or equal to G. So integral mod F will be less than or equal to integral G. But G is in L1 mu, so this is finite. Therefore, integral mod F G is finite. Mod F is finite. So F is also in L1 mu. That is trivial. Now mod Fn minus F, apply triangle inequality, that is less than or equal to mod Fn plus mod F. But mod Fn is bounded by mod G and mod F is bounded by mod G. So it is bounded by 2G. Now you consider integral of the limit infimum of 2G minus mod Fn minus F d. Suppose we have this inequality. I mean, here I skip this inequality. I mean, I will state that this inequality is true due to a well-known result called Fatho's lemma. So I will state that after this. So you can take this limit infimum outside, but you'll end up with an inequality. So you have this inequality here. Now, here what happens if you apply limit infimum? This, since Fn goes to F, this part goes to 0. Therefore, it is 2G only. So integral 2G dv less than or equal to. Here 2G part will not be affected by taking limit infimum. So that is coming outside. So integral 2G plus limit infimum of remaining part is minus of mod Fn minus F. And I'm using a property that limit infimum of minus will be minus of limit supremum of. So using that, you obtain that limit supremum of mod Fn minus F is less than or equal to 0. But this is non-negative. So it is always greater than or equal to 0. So you have equal to 0. So that means limit supremum is equal to 0. Therefore, limit of integral mod Fn minus F goes to 0. The proof is more or less clear, provided we have this inequality. This inequality is a consequence of the well-known Fatho's lemma. So let me state that here. I am not going to prove that. That means you can take limit infimum outside, but you will be ending up with an inequality. That is what Fatho's lemma. Okay. So let me skip that proof for you. So any questions so far? I'm going to, so actually this part we were supposed to do this yesterday. Now, any questions? Any question, any clarifications? Okay. Okay, so let me move to the more important part of the story. That means Lebesgue spaces or LP spaces. Okay. So let us begin with a measurable subset of R. So you begin with a measurable subset of R. Now whatever I am doing will be on some subset E of R, which is measurable. Okay, and you can replace E by any interval if you want, the whole R itself. And keep in your mind that I am not assuming that measure of E is finite. Whatever things I do, most of them will be valid for any measurable subset. But there are some differences between finite measure spaces and other spaces. I mean, that I will explain later. So now you have a measurable subset of R, and you take 1 less than or equal to P finite. A measurable function f on E is called P integrable if this is true. I mean, integral over E mod f power P is finite. Okay. So this is what I call P integrable function. Okay. So in fact, I am going to collect all P integrable functions and I'm going to construct a space. Okay. Now let me state two important inequalities. In fact, the countable part of this was already stated last maybe we discussed this last couple of days. So now we are going to deal with the continuous part of these inequalities. Again, I will not prove this. These are standard results. I mean, most of you will do it in a typical course of measure theory or function analysis. So let me skip the proof, but this inequality is very important. So first one is Helder's inequality again. Now instead of summation, you will have integration here. Remember, integration is a kind of uncountable sum. So naturally, we expect integration here instead of summation. So when 1 less than p less than infinity, then what happens? You have a q which satisfies this 1 by p plus 1 by q equal to 1. Now Helder's inequality is similar to the countable situation. Integral mod fg d mu is bound less than or equal to integral mod fp d mu all power 1 by p into integral mod g power q all power 1 by q. And Minkowski's inequality is even valid for p equal to 1. That is actually a triangle inequality in some sense. So integral over e mod f plus g power p d mu all power 1 by p is less than or equal to integral over mod fp power 1 by p plus integral over mod g power p power 1 by p. So this is what Minkowski's inequality is. But again, I only assumed that f and g are measurable functions on E. Therefore, it can be infinity also. Therefore, infinity, it can take values infinity and minus infinity. Therefore, I have to avoid the possibility that infinity minus infinity occurs, right? So I take care of that. That means I demand that measure of f inverse of infinity intersection g inverse of minus infinity is 0, and similarly the other one. So just to avoid the possibility that infinity minus infinity would arise. Right? So that should not arise. So if you assume that f and g are p integrable, this condition is automatically satisfied. So that is it. So because f equal to infinity cannot have f cannot attain infinity in a set of positive measure whenever integral mod fp is finite. That's it. So now, so are you okay? So now for measurable functions on E, we define an equivalence relation as follows. So we are going to define an equivalence relation. So we say that f equal to g if f equal to g almost everywhere. So what do you mean by almost everywhere equal? That means f need not be equal to g everywhere. Instead, the points where you collect the points for f not equal to g, and that set will have measure 0. That means t such that ft not equal to gt should be of measure 0. So such a situation is called f equal to g almost everywhere. So this almost everywhere is used to denote that some properties is true except in a measure 0 set. That's it. So now this is our space LPE. So remember that you consider the set of all p integrable functions on E. That's a big set. Now on this set, you give an equivalence relation. This is an equivalence relation. That is something you can easily verify. So then what happens, that equivalence relation will give you a partition to the set. I mean, set of all p integrable functions will be partitioned to equivalence classes, right? So that collection of class of equivalent class of functions is called LPE. So LPE is denotes the set of all equivalence classes of p integral functions on E. I mean, equivalent classes with respect to this equivalence relation. So now tell me if you have some questions regarding the definition of LPE. This is very important. In fact, this is one of the most important definition which you should understand. So if you are comfortable with that, please let me know. Otherwise, I can explain it again. So did you understand the definition of LPE?
Yes, sir.
All of you?
Yes, sir.
So what are the elements in LPE? What are the elements in LPE?
Equivalence.
P integral.
Are there functions?
They're equivalence classes.
They are not merely functions, they are equivalence class of functions, right? Now, you recall my first lecture where we introduced real numbers. Okay? How did we introduce real numbers? what are real numbers? How do they look like?
Equivalence class of Cauchy sequence of rational numbers.
Yeah, that's it. So they are equivalence class of Cauchy sequence of rational numbers. Okay. So you should understand the similarity between real number system and LP spaces. Okay. So there we had equivalence classes. So real number system is basically the elements are equivalence classes. Here also we are having equivalence classes. So that's a very important thing. In fact, we can obtain LP using equivalence class of Cauchy sequence of continuous functions from CAB, C01 or C of A. That is also possible. So there is one way to obtain LPE. So this construction is similar to the construction of real number system. So that is something which you should keep in your mind. Okay. Now this is our space where we are going to play with. So this LPE, I am going to define this metric dp of fg. This is integral over e mod f minus g power p d mu all power 1 by p. Remember, we had such a metric in the countable case on small LP, and this is exactly similar to that, but we are in the continuous case here. So we will prove that this is a metric, but before that you should keep another thing in your mind. Suppose you are taking E to be the set of our natural number set, okay? And instead of Lebesgue measure, if you are taking the counting measure, I did not introduce counting measure, but counting measure is very simple. If you have a finite set, you give the value, cardinality of that set, number of elements in that set. And if you have an infinite set, you just simply give infinity. And if you introduce integration in the same way, so the capital LP can be identified as small LP. So you can keep in your mind that small LP is actually a special case of capital LP. But here we are dealing with Lebesgue integration only, Lebesgue measure only. But if you do it in an abstract way, using counting measure and so on, you can obtain small LP also. Now, this is my metric, dpfg is equal to integral over e mod f minus g power p all power 1 by p. Now, my claim is that it's a metric. So what are the things to be proved to prove that it's a metric? Come on, tell me.
dxy is greater than or equal to 0.
That's trivial.
Equal to 0 if and only if x equal to y.
Yeah, it is greater than or equal to 0 trivial. Isn't it trivial? Because see, we are integrating negative things, right? So definitely it will be greater than or equal to 0. Okay?
Yes.
Now suppose it is 0. That means this quantity is 0. Okay? I want to prove that f equal to g, right? What I want to prove is that f equal to g. That is the thing, right? dpfg equal to 0 if and only if f equal to g. Isn't it?
Yes, sir.
But one more thing is there. See, LPE is containing equivalence class of functions, right? So whatever I am defining here, dpfg, f will be in one class, one equivalent class, g will be in another equivalence class. I am choosing some candidate from that equivalence class and defining this. Okay? So in fact, there is a step here where you should make sure that this is well defined. So did you understand why this should be well defined? Why it is well defined, or why we should make sure that verify that it is well defined? Because LP elements or equivalence class of function f in equivalence class, g in equivalence class. You have two equivalence classes. So other distance are what we did, we chose one element from f, the equivalence class of f, and one element from the equivalence class of g. And using that, we introduced this. We defined this. Okay? Suppose I am choosing one f and somebody else is choosing some other f1 from the same equivalence class. Similarly, I chose g and somebody else chose g1 from the same equivalence class. So we should prove that this definition is independent of that choice. Isn't it?
Yes, sir.
So that is inverse trivial because if f equal to g, see, f and f1 are in the same equivalence class means f equal to f1 almost everywhere, right? So if f and f1 are equal almost everywhere, then their integral will be same. That's it. Because integral on a set of measure 0 is 0. Whatever value f has. That is something which we observed earlier. So set of measure 0 will not contribute to integral. Therefore, this is well defined. You can verify that. Make sure that it is true. So similarly, another thing is that I want to prove that f equal to g. Suppose I want to prove that f equal to g in LP. What should I prove? So what is meant by f equal to g here? Can you tell me? Yeah. So f equal to g here means f and g are from the same equivalence class, right? So that happens when f equal to g almost everywhere. So it suffices to show that f equal to g almost everywhere, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So you assume that dpfg equals 0. That means this is 0. Now you construct a set En. What is En? N is a natural number. Take all t belongs to E with the property that mod f minus g t power p is greater than 1 by n. That is En. And you take union of En. Union of En means mod f minus g power p greater than 0. Because suppose mod f minus g at t power p greater than 0. Then you can find some n such that 1 by n is between this 0 and this, right? So if t is here, then t is in En for some n. That means this set is actually the union of all Ens. So are you convinced with this? Are you comfortable with this?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So this is the union of, so this is what we have. So mod ft minus gt power p greater 0, the set of all t with this property is actually the union of Ens. Now you can compute the integral over En f minus g power p. Since En is a subset of E, this is less than or equal to integral over E mod f minus g power p. Now this is 0, dpfg is 0, therefore this is 0. This is 0 implies that this is 0. Therefore, integral over En mod f minus g power p is 0. But let us compute this. See, on En, we know that mod f minus g power p is greater than 1 by n, right? So you can replace this by, this is greater than 1 by n into integral of 1 d mu. What is integral of 1 d mu? That is measure of En. Isn't it? By definition, it's a simple function. So this quantity is greater than or equal to 1 by n into measure of En. But we have proved that this is 0. Therefore, 1 by n into mu of En is less than or equal to 0. That means mu of En less than or equal to 0. That means mu of En equal to 0. Okay? But mu of En equal to 0 will imply that mu of union En is also equal to 0. Okay? But union En is the set of all t such that mod f minus g at t power p is greater than 0. So this set has measure 0. So that, what do you mean by that? That means mod f minus g power p equal to 0 almost everywhere, because the non-zero on the set measure 0. So except in this set we have this is 0. That means f equal to g almost everywhere. So is that okay? The proof is okay?
Yes, sir.
So now, so we proved the second quantity. Now the third property, this property is easy. dpfg equal to dpgf is trivial because we are in the absolute value. Now triangle inequality, how do you prove triangle inequality? Simply add and subtract x and apply Minkowski's inequality. So we already assumed Minkowski inequality without proof. We stated it. But you apply that, instead of f you have f minus h and g you have g minus h. Simply apply Minkowski's inequality, you obtain triangle inequality for this metric. Hence LPE is a metric space with respect to this metric. Okay. Now we are going to introduce the corresponding p equal to infinity case. Okay. Yeah. Now for L infinity E, we need some notion called essential boundedness. A measurable function f is called essentially bounded. See, essentially bounded means that function need not be bounded. But what we need is that you need some bound such that after that, the values of f is taken only in a set of measure 0. That means there exists a beta such that mod ft greater than beta happens only in a set of measure 0. T's with the mod ft greater than beta has measure 0. So such a beta is called an essential bound. That means this need not be bounded. It can take several values, unbounded values, but the thing is that those values are taken in a measure 0, set of measure 0. So such a function is called an essentially bounded function. Okay, and you can easily see that all bounded functions are essentially bounded. Hence, you have plenty of examples. Now, but there are essentially bounded functions which are not bounded. For example, you take a normal function and say some function takes the value 1, 2, etc. n and so on at some discrete points. But this happens only in a set of measure 0, so no problem. So now, for an essentially bounded function, you take collect all the essential bounds. So this is called an essential bound, and take the infimum of that. That is something we denote by alpha. And this alpha is called, so my claim is that this alpha is also an essential bound. You take the infimum of all essential bounds, you get some alpha. Infimum exists because these are non-negative numbers. Betas are non-negative numbers, so it is bounded below. So infimum is denoted by alpha, and this alpha is called the essential supremum. And we are going to prove that this is also an essential bound for f. So my claim is that alpha is also an essential bound for f. So that is easy. Because to prove that something is an essential bound, it suffices to show that this set has measure 0. What is this set? T such that mod ft greater than alpha. But this you can write it as union of T such that mod ft greater than alpha plus 1 by n. So if you take union, you will get this. So that is the same thing. So it suffices to show that this has measure 0. But alpha plus 1 by n is a number which is strictly greater than alpha, and alpha is the infimum, which is the greatest lower bound. So something greater than that is not a lower bound of the essential bounds. So you will find a beta n between alpha and alpha plus 1 by n, but beta n is an essential bound for mod f. And also you have this inclusion, T such that mod ft greater than beta n is always contains T such that mod ft greater than alpha plus 1 by n, because alpha plus 1 by n is bigger than beta n. So this has a lesser chance to happen. So this inclusion is there. But this has measure 0, therefore this also has measure 0. So what we proved is that these sets are having measure 0, therefore their union will have measure 0. So this set has measure 0, that means alpha is also an essential bound. So this alpha is called the essential supremum, and we denote it by S sup, essential sup mod f with E denoted here. Okay? Now you can prove several things. Essential supremum of mod f plus g is less than or equal to essential supremum of mod f e plus essential supremum of mod g. How do you prove this? So are you okay with the definition of essential supremum? Okay. Do you have any? Come on, let me know.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So let me prove that this triangle inequality, essential supremum of f plus g. So how do you prove that? You denote alpha to be essential supremum of mod f and beta to be essential supremum of mod g. Now you consider, see, we want to prove that alpha plus beta is an essential bound for this. Suppose I prove that alpha plus beta is an essential bound for f plus g, then definitely since essential supremum is the lower infimum of all essential bounds, essential supremum of f plus g will be less than or equal to alpha plus beta, and we are done. So we consider all t belongs to E with the property that mod ft plus gt greater than alpha plus beta. But this is contained in, you apply triangle inequality here, so this is less than or equal to mod ft plus mod gt. So this set is contained in mod ft plus mod gt greater than alpha plus beta. Because whenever this is true, this is also true. So simple inequality. Now here you have an inclusion. In fact, this identity may not be correct. I have inclusion here. There's a error actually. So this is contained in here because mod ft plus mod gt greater than alpha plus beta will imply that either mod ft greater than alpha or mod gt greater than beta. Because if mod ft is less than or equal to alpha and mod gt less than or equal to beta, then their sum will be less than or equal to alpha plus beta. So this will not satisfy. So whenever this is satisfied, one of them will satisfy. So this is contained in the union of this. But this has measure 0, this has measure 0. So the whole set will have measure 0. So all of them have measure 0. So this will tell you that alpha plus beta is an essential bound for mod f plus g. And essential supreme of mod f plus g will be always less than or equal to all essential bounds. So you have this inequality. And this is something you can use to obtain a metric on L infinity. So what is L infinity? L infinity of D denotes the set of all equivalence classes of essentially bounded functions on E. So we know what is essentially bounded now. We know what do you mean by an equivalence class. That means we define the equivalence class f equal to g if f equal to g almost everywhere. So you collect all essentially bounded function and make these equivalence classes, and you have your L infinity of E. This is a very important space. And on this L infinity, we define D infinity Fg to be essential supreme of mod f minus g. And now we have almost, in fact, we proved completely that it's a metric because we already have triangle inequality and all other inequalities are, all other properties are very trivial. So this is a metric. This is a metric here. So this gives you a rich supply of examples for the objects which we are going to consider. So this is known as LP spaces. So this plays a very crucial role in the theory as well as in practical applications. So we'll try to understand it further. Now let us prove completeness of. So we have already obtained metrics on these spaces, and as we did in the small LP spaces, we proved that small LP spaces are complete, right? Now we are going to prove that this is also complete, and we'll see more algebraic structure here. But first, let me prove that LP spaces are complete for any P. So what should I prove to prove that LP spaces are complete? Come on.
Take a Cauchy sequence.
You should begin with a Cauchy sequence. So now I'm treating P equal to infinity separately. So let me assume that P is finite. So that because the metrics are different. So now let Fn be a Cauchy sequence here. Take epsilon equal to alpha 1 by 2. Then direction n1 says that dp, this is P. dp fn fm less than 1 by 2 after a stage, and you denote fn1 to be this one. Then epsilon you take a 1 by 2 square, then you will get another fn2 with this property. So continuing like this, you will get fn1 a subsequence actually. You will get a subsequence fn1, fn2, etc. with the property that dp fnk plus 1 is less than 1 by 2 power k. I need this to make some series summable, so that's why I chose like this. And you denote fn not to be, you take to be 0. Okay. Now these are some of my candidates. So you denote. See, I'm going to apply dominated convergence theorem. So this is my GNT for a capital N. GNT is summation j equals 0 to n absolute value of fnj plus 1t minus fnj. And GT is the infinite series, corresponding infinite series. J equals 0 to infinity, absolute value of x. I mean, GNT converges to GT. That's what we have. Okay? For each t belongs to E. Now, what we are going to do? First, we are going to prove that. Yeah. So we are going to prove that each GNs are in LP. So that is easy. I mean, you look at integral E, GNT power P. Now you substitute it, since GNT is a non-negative thing, you need actually absolute value. So you have this. Now we have a finite sum inside and power P all power 1 by P. Remember, you can apply Minkowski's inequalities for this n terms. If there are 2 terms, you know the things. I mean, just repeatedly apply Minkowski's inequality. So you can take the sum outside with an inequality. That's what Minkowski's inequality. So you have this. And this is actually dp fnj plus 1 fnj. Now, the first term is j equals 0, you get fn1, dp fn1, fn0. And remaining terms, we have already chosen such that it is less than 1 by 2 power g. So this is what we get. So this is your first inequality which we required. Now you look at integral over e mod g power p power 1 by b. You know that mod g, so recall the definition of g. G is limit gn, okay? Gn, this is a finite, the nth partial sum of this series. So gn converts to g. So you start from g. So g, you write it as limit gn. Now this limit you can take out because of MCT, monotone convergence theorem. Because recall again the definition of gn. Gn actually increases to gt, okay? Because we are having non-negative terms here. As n increases, you are giving more terms, okay? More non-negative terms. You are adding more non-negative terms. So you are having an increasing, monotonely increasing sequence converted to gt. So that you can apply monotone convergence theorem. So that you can interchange the limit and integral. Limit comes outside and gn here. But this integral, we have already obtained this inequality. So we can substitute it here. So limit n tends to infinity, this quantity. And this is independent of n. So this is, and this is bounded by 1. Because this infinite series converges to 1. So what happens that you obtain that the norm of G is finite, or LP norm of G is finite, therefore G belongs to LPE. Now G is in LP. So okay, are you comfortable with the so far developments? Any question? Any question? We proved that integral mod G power P is finite, right? Is that okay? Yes or no?
Sir, not that clear.
Okay, kindly let me know what is not clear. So we,
Sir,
you have a Cauchy sequence, and we can consider subsequence with this property. That's fine, right? No?
yes, sir.
Yeah. So you have a subsequence with this property. Now I am constructing Gn and G in this way. Okay? Gn is this absolute value sum and Gt is this. Okay? In such a way that Gn monotonically increases to G. Is that okay?
Okay, sir.
Now I am simply taking the integral, P integral. Okay? And here I am applying the Minkowski's inequality. I mean, Minkowski's inequality is, we proved it for 2 terms, but you can easily extend it to n terms. Okay? So you have summation outside and with an inequality. And that will give you this. I mean, simply substituting, you'll get this. And mod GP, we apply monotone convergence theorem here. I mean, limit you interchange, and you apply this inequality here, and finally you'll obtain that this is finite. Is that okay now?
Okay, sir.
You may have to make sure that this is okay. So G is in LP. Now you keep in your mind that G is an LP function now. An LP function means integral mod G power P is finite. Then G cannot take the value infinity in a positive measure set. Because if G of t equal to infinity in a set of positive measure, then in that set, its integral will become infinity. That's what we know. Therefore, G of t should be finite almost all for almost all t. Because it is finite almost everywhere. Even though it can take value infinity, but only in a set of measures. So G of t is finite almost all t. That is important because you look at the definition of G of t, it is actually the absolute sum of these quantities, and it tells you that this is finite almost for almost all t. So when some sequence of complex numbers is absolute value summable, then it is summable. That's it. So we are going to use that. Okay. So this is absolutely summable. The series is absolutely convergent. Therefore, it is a convergent series for almost all t. So that means this series converges to something. So that is our candidate. You denote f of t equal to this. Remember, this f is well defined on almost all t belongs to E. I mean, there are set of measure 0 where f need not be defined, but we are not bothered about that set. Okay. So are you okay with the definition of ft? Is that okay? F, how does f come? Okay. Please, please feel free to tell me what you feel. Yeah. If you find it difficult, please let me know. Now, come on, all of you can speak up. I mean, if you feel some discomfort, please let me know. After all, we are not going to cover any syllabus or anything. I mean, we are not in such a target. But whatever we discuss, it should be useful, right? So, and you let me know if you feel some difficulty or whatever things you don't understand.
ഇത്രയും കൂടി സ്ലോ ആയിട്ട് പറയോ
Not clear to me.
ഇത്രയും കൂടി സ്ലോ ആയിട്ട്
Okay. I can be slow. Yeah. But can you tell me what are the things you understood? Yeah. You please tell me what are the things you know. I mean, you could understand from this proof. What are the things you already understood? So did you understand the way in which we chose the subsequence?
Yes, sir.
Then do you understand the way in which we define this Gn and G? Okay. So my ultimate aim is that I am going to prove that this is absolutely summable. I mean, this series is absolutely summable. Okay. For that, what I do, I'll prove that this G is in LP. If I prove that G is in LP, then definitely this G should be finite almost everywhere. Therefore, this should be finite almost everywhere. Therefore, it is absolutely summable, and hence it should be summable. So this is the process where I proved that. I mean, can you just go through this and tell me, let me know what you did not understand? Let me not repeat it. Can you just let me know what is not clear to you?
ഇതൊക്കെ മനസ്സിലായി സാർ വീണ്ടും റിപ്പീറ്റ് ചെയ്തപ്പോൾ മനസ്സിലായിരുന്നു.
Okay, so you agree that G is in LP. Okay, therefore what happens is that G is finite almost all T for almost all T. So what is the advantage is that you have an absolutely summable series here. Therefore, I mean, except in a measure 0 set, therefore it is summable. Every absolutely convergent series of complex numbers is convergent. So you have a convergent series here. Now we use this convergent series to introduce our candidate for, see, ultimately we want to prove that Fn converges to some F, right? So this convergent series is what we use to obtain a candidate. So we define f of t to be the limit of this. That means summation j equal to 0 to infinity fn j plus 1t minus fn jt. And this is defined only for almost all t belongs to p. Okay. Now we consider fn k. So from here we know that fn k will be j equals 0 to k minus 1 fn j plus 1t minus fn j. I mean, things will get cancelled, terms will get cancelled in here, and you'll obtain fn kt only, right? Therefore, I mean, that means you take the nth partial sum of this series, or k minus 1th partial sum of this series, you are getting fn kt. So you know that see, what do you mean by this? I mean, if you write f of t equal to this infinite series, what is the meaning of that? Can you tell me that? So what do you mean by writing an infinite series equal to some f of t? F of t equal to some...
Sequence of partial sums അതിലോട്ട് convert ചെയ്യും.
So this tells you that the sequence of partial sum converges to this, right? So you take the sequence of partial sum, that is this one. But this is equal to fn kt because the terms will get cancelled. Okay? because zeroth term and first term will be here. And the second time you'll have first term and second term. So first term gets cancelled and so on. I mean, it gets cancelled here. So only the last term and first term will remain. First term means zeroth term, but zeroth term is 0. Fn 0 is 0. So this is Fn kt. I mean, this is simply by cancellation. Okay. So this converges to f of t. So what we obtained is that Fn kt converges to f of t for almost all t. Okay. Also, you take the absolute value of Fn kt. That is absolute value of this. Apply triangle inequality. You will obtain this. And you know that this is actually gkt. Sorry, this is gkt, right? So this is bounded by mod gt. Because mod gt is, what is gt? Gt is simply the infinite series with these terms. Infinite series with these terms. Okay? So we have to add more non-negative terms to obtain gt. So this is bounded by mod gt. Okay? So we have Fn kt bounded by g, and we already obtained by g is in LP. So you can apply, what is that? What you can apply now? What you can apply? Fn kt is dominated by an LP function, so you can apply dominated convergence theorem, and we obtain whatever we need. You start from integral mod fp. This is, you can interchange the limit and integral, so it is integral limit of the integral mod fnp. But mod fnp is bounded by mod gp. That is what we have seen, and this is finite. Therefore, our candidate is eligible now because our candidate is in LP. Okay. So our candidate is in LP, f is in LP. Now what we do, you consider mod f minus fnk power p. This is bounded by mod f plus mod fnk bounded by mod g. So you have this, and again you can apply dominated convergence theorem. So interchange limit and integral, and you obtain that dp of fnkf converges to f. So we have convergence with respect to the metric. Therefore, we can say that this subsequence converges to f in LP. Okay? Do you agree that, we obtained the subsequence? I mean, we started from a Cauchy sequence, and we obtained that there exists a subsequence of that Cauchy sequence which converges to f, some f in LP. Remember, this not merely this convergence is with respect to this metric. So, do you agree with that? So, anything else remaining to be proved here? I am supposed to prove that this Cauchy sequence is convergent. Instead, I proved that there exists a subsequence which converges to something. Is that enough? Is that enough?
Yes, sir. Since it is a metric space.
No, actually, for a Cauchy sequence, if you have a convergent subsequence, then the Cauchy sequence itself will be convergent. That is easy, right? Because after all, a subsequence converging to some f. But the thing is that since it is a Cauchy sequence, the terms gets closer and closer. Okay? So by a simple triangle inequality, you can prove that the whole sequence itself will converge to f. Okay? That is the specialty of a Cauchy sequence. Generally, I mean, a sequence in the subsequence converge the whole sequence converge. But Cauchy sequence that is enough, right? Do you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
So we proved that LP is complete provided P is finite. Now P equal to infinity. Now here the matrix is changed. Metric is changed. It is the sup metric. I mean essential sup metric. Now again we begin with a Cauchy sequence here. Fn be a Cauchy sequence in L infinity. Now what is AJ? So you fix an J. I mean the term J. Now you take set of all t belongs to E such that mod fj of t is greater than the essential supremum of mod fj. Okay? You know that such t's may arise, but the collection of all such t will have measure 0, right? Because essential suprematinekal validavunna mod fj യുടെ values validavunna t കൾ എന്തായിരിക്കണം? അതിന്റെ measure എന്തായിരിക്കണം? 0, because this is an essential bound, right?
Yes, sir.
So measure of AJ will be 0. Same thing you apply for BMN, you denote by mod FMT minus mod FNT greater than essential supremum of. So what is the measure of BMN? Can you tell me what is the measure of BMN? This is BMN. What is that? And there you
0.
0 because why it is 0? എന്താ കാരണം? Simply tell me what is the reason. Just tell me whatever you feel. Why measure of BMN should be 0 and measure of AJ should be 0?
By the definition of essential supremum.
Actually, essential supremum is also an essential bound. That's what we proved. And essential bound പ്രത്യേകം എന്താണ്?
That is the infimum.
അതിനേക്കാൾ മുകളിലുള്ളതിനൊക്കെ set of measures 0 ആയിരിക്കും. So AJ and BMN has measure 0. Now you take F equal to union of all these things. So what we are doing actually, see if we have bounded functions and bounded sequence everything, we can manipulate things. So we are avoiding this possibility that this is greater than essential supremum, this is greater than essential supremum and so on. So we take all such things and take the union of them and we write it as F, and we know that since each term has 0, measure 0, this measure of F will be also 0. So outside this F, you will have FJT, each FJT will be bounded. I mean, FJT will be bounded, right? Because that will be less than or equal to this thing. Similarly, FM and FN will be bounded. So outside this F, you are dealing with bounded functions only. Okay? So therefore, on E minus F, Fn is uniformly quotient. I mean, we are dealing with submetric, okay, which we already did actually. In C01 case, we worked with that, right? Do you remember that? So if we have bounded functions, then it is easy thing. So we have sequence of bounded functions, uniform, so with respect to the uniform submetric. So every convergence, Cauchy sequence will be convergent there. So you have Fn converges to F uniformly for some bounded functions. So this proof is exactly similar to what we did for submetric on C01, nothing else. Okay, so shall I leave that proof to you? I did not write it here, but you can prove that on E minus F, you have Fn is uniformly Cauchy. Therefore, we can prove that Fn converges to F uniformly for some bounded functions on E minus F. Do you agree with this? Just imitate the proof what we did for C01. You simply used C, it's a boundedness, uniform boundedness. So can you do that? Shall I leave it to you?
Sir.
Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So we assume that on E minus F you have convergence. So what we do, we define F tilde to be F on E minus F and 0 on F. Since measure of F is 0, we are not bothered what happens on F. So F tilde is in L infinity and simply this will happen. So we proved that L infinity is also a complete metric space. So this is the very important thing. So we obtained a complete metric space, not a single one. In fact, LP, the whole LP is a complete metric space with respect to the concerned P metric, BP. Okay? So now what is remaining, apart from these topological properties induced by the matrix, this also has some algebraic structure. Because we have already seen that when F and G are in LP, then F plus G will be in LP, that is easy. Similarly, alpha F plus beta G will be in LP. So what kind of a space is this actually? If such a property is there, what do you call? What do you call them?
Vector spaces.
Yeah, they are actually vector spaces. Okay. So now what we do, we are going to some general discussion on vector spaces. Okay. So we obtained a class of a rich supply of examples for vector space. We already proved that it's a complete metric space. So complete metric space is a kind of analytical property using the metric space structure. But in addition, we have an algebraic structure here, right? So we are going to deal with such spaces where we have also an algebraic property as well as a topological thing, okay? And their interplanes. So now we are going to have some general discussion on vector spaces, okay? So, yeah, so before going to the vector space theory, so let me know, how many of you are familiar with this vector space idea? Linear algebra. So all of you have done a course in linear algebra, right? You do that?
Yes, sir.
So all of you are familiar with what is a vector space and all, right? Yes?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So what I do, I will not define it rigorously. Instead what I do, I will simply give examples. In fact, most of the examples are already covered in these lectures. But let me just recall. I did not mention the algebraic structure. Vector space structure. That's why I'm repeating this. So recall Kn. Okay. You please tell me what are the operations required to make a vector space?
Vector addition and scalar multiplication.
Okay. So Kn, how do you define addition?
Coordinate-wise addition.
Coordinate-wise addition. Similarly, scalar multiplication.
Coordinate-wise multiplication.
So let me leave this. You can verify the properties, everything. So now this comes from the usual vector addition geometry and so on. So shall I skip all these things? So now sequence spaces. In fact, for vectors, to make a vector space, you don't need any assumption. You can take any arbitrary sequence, any collection of sequences in K, and you can define in a similar way vector space. Now, one very important thing, there is a zero in the vector space, right? What is the zero in Kn?
Zero tuple. All elements are zeros.
So here, this is the set of all sequences in K. So what would be the zero vector here, zero element here?
Constant zero sequence.
Sequence zero. Now LP spaces. So we introduced small LP space, right? So let me just recall the definition. Now, you know that it has the same structure, right? What is the zero here? The zero sequence. Okay. Now, x and y are there means x plus y is also there, and alpha x is there. So are you comfortable in proving that it's a vector space? Any question regarding this? I guess all of you know that it's a vector space, right? Simply use the vector addition. Use a component-wise addition of sequences. So any doubts regarding making that this small LP as a vector space? Because the set of all sequences form a vector space, then these things are subspaces of that. They are special kind of sequences. So any doubt regarding this? Or should I explain all the details?
No, sir.
So now let me introduce a very important example of a vector space. Some abstract one. You start from a non-empty set, S, okay? And my V is set of all functions from S to K. K is our C or R, okay? All real or complex valued functions defined on S. This is a kind of function space. Now, let me define the vector addition. So you have two functions there, f and g. So how do you add two functions, f plus g? What is f plus g? Point-wise addition. F plus g at S is fs plus gs, okay? Similarly, scalar multiplication, alpha f at S is alpha into f at S, okay? So we can verify the vector space structure, right? So is that okay for you to verify? It's easy, right? You take any set S and work it. Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
This is a very important vector space. In fact, by different choices of S, you can find most of the familiar vector spaces. For example, you choose 1, 2 up to n, then they are simply functions defined on the set 1, 2, 3 up to n. You can identify it with k. Because each function on this set is determined by its values at f1, 2, 3, etc. n. That means each function gives you an n-tuple, and similarly each n-tuple will give you a function on this set. So this can be identified with kn. And if you take natural number set, it can be identified with the example which we just discussed. That means the set of all sequences, all sequence spaces. And most of the spaces can be identified as some subspace of this. Okay? So are you comfortable with these function spaces? Now some subspace of this, say C01. This is a vector space, right? C01 is a vector space because f and g are continuous, means f plus g is also continuous. Similarly, alpha f is continuous and so on. Now, what is the zero here in C01? Can you tell me what is the zero here? What is the zero element?
Zero function.
That's a zero function. Okay. Now, another interesting example is polynomial functions on R. Then C prime 0, 1, I mean continuously differentiable functions. You can add and multiply by scalar. Now, this is something we have seen, R01, the set of all Riemann integrable functions. That also forms a vector space. So, we have seen plenty of examples now. Yeah. Now, set of all matrices, all n by n matrices, that also forms a vector space, typical addition. Set of all polynomials of degree at most n, that also form a vector space. Okay. So you have several vector spaces. We have seen several examples. Most of the examples we have seen in the whole course, vector spaces. Now what we are going to do, we are going to distinguish between finite-dimensional vector spaces and infinite-dimensional vector spaces, and vector spaces with some topology in it. Okay. So maybe I will take a break now. So I will come back with basis, dimension, and so on. Okay. So 5 minutes break.
Okay, sir.
Okay. Shall we start?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, yeah. So we are in the. So we are. Okay. So we are considering the basis and dimension. Okay. So what is a basis? So for example, you consider Kn and consider the standard thing. I mean, E1, E2, etc. En, where Ei is 0, 0, x elsewhere, and ith entry you have 1. Okay. Now you consider the set E1, E2, etc. En subset of Kn. That property of En is that you start from any x here. X you can write it as x1. So x is x1, x2, etc. xn. Then x can be written as x1 E1 plus x2 E2 plus etc. plus xn En. That means x can be written as a linear combination of E1, E2, etc. En. And this is unique also, because if you write x as some other linear combination, I mean using some other coefficients, say arbitrary coefficients, alpha 1, E1, etc. plus alpha and En, you can prove that each alpha I will be equal to xn. Okay? So that means every element in Kn, you can write it as a unique linear combination of E1, E2, etc. En. Okay? Such a subset is called a basis. Okay? A subset of a vector space with this property. So what is that property? So B subset of Kn is such that you start from any element, any vector in Kn. We should be able to write it as a unique linear combination of elements from B. So if a B has such a property, so if B has such a property, we call that we say that B is a basis. And strictly speaking, this is called a Hamel basis. Okay, so I guess the definition is more or less clear to you, right? You can also define it in a different way using linear independence and span. But that is equivalent to say that this expression is unique. Okay, so for example, if you apply it for 0, since the expression is unique, 0 should be written in a unique way. So you can write the 0 into E1 plus 0 into E2, etc. So each alpha should be 0. So that's what linear independence, right? So as all of you know, basis is a linearly independent set which spans the space. Okay? I guess this notion of basis is clear to all of you, right? Now, let us look at some examples. You take only polynomials of degree at most n, then you can write everything as polynomial means this expression a0 plus a1 t plus a etc. plus a n t raised to n with a n not equal to 0. I mean degree at most n, so n can be 0. Now here 1 t square etc. t raised to n is a basis. And for Rn we have seen the standard basis. Of course, vectors of this form is also a basis. And for P of R, I mean set of all polynomial functions, we have 1 t square etc. can be a basis. So we have seen that the basis can be finite, basis can have infinitely many elements also, right? This is an example for a countable basis. Now the fact is that basis can be uncountable also. I will come to that. Before going to that, let us address this question. Does there exist a basis for all vector spaces? So what is your answer? Does there exist a vector space for all vector spaces? Oh, sorry. Does there exist a basis for all vector spaces? Hamel basis? Yes or no?
Sir, Hamel basis.
Hamel basis is the usual basis which you refer to. I mean, it is actually called Hamel basis. I mean,
Sir, then no.
why?
Sir, in the case of LP, small LP. There's a basis, but it's not finite. So it's not Hamel.
No,
So
Hamel
there,
not be finite. So I have, see, this example, the third example, this is this is a countable basis, right? It is not finite. Hamel basis need not be finite. And the fact I wrote here is that it can be uncountable also.
okay.
So whatever I say here, basis means Hamel basis only. Okay, that can be finite, that can be countable, that can be uncountable, anything can happen. But the fact is that
Okay.
it exists. For every non-zero vector spaces, you have a Hamel basis. So have you seen the proof that the Hamel basis exists? So there is a very important lemma known as Zorn's lemma. This is something equivalent to axiom of choice, and this is something equivalent to existence of Hamel basis for every non-zero vector space. I will prove it in a general setting. So let me just state the Zorn's lemma. So what is Zorn's lemma? You start from a partially ordered set. So what do you mean by a partially ordered set? A set equipped with a relation which you denote by this. This relation should be reflexive, transitive, and antisymmetric. So that is what we need. So for equivalence relation, you need symmetry. So that is violated here. It is antisymmetric. So by antisymmetry, I mean if x related to y and y related to x, then x equal to y. I mean, yeah, that is what antisymmetry. So symmetry means x related to y should imply that y related to x, right? So in a partially ordered set, an element is called an upper bound of a subset E if every element of E related to S for all if every element of E related to S, then we say that S is an upper bound. Okay, I mean, keep in your mind that this is a relation. This is not the usual order which we use. And an element is a maximal element if anything related to that, if S related to some other element, then that should be equal to S. So such an element is called a maximal element. Okay. So are you comfortable with the basic definition? I mean, this is something which we will use. So what is Zorn's lemma? Zorn's lemma tells you that in a partially ordered set, if every totally ordered subset has an upper bound, then the set has a maximal element. So what do you mean by totally ordered set? Totally ordered set is a partially ordered set with an additional property. That means any two elements are comparable. Or in other words, it can be also called a chain or something. Okay, you can compare any two elements between them. I mean, if A and B are there, you can say either A related to B or B related to A. In a partially ordered set, there may be elements which are not related to each other. Okay, so if every totally ordered subset has an upper bound, then you have a maximum. This is what Zorn's lemma. Okay, so I will use this Zorn's lemma to prove that every non-zero vector space has a Hamel basis. So have you seen this proof? Have you seen this proof?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
In Lemma test.
Okay. So most of you have done this proof, right? So however, I will just sketch the proof. So the proof is very simple. Actually, what does it tell you? So you start from a non-zero vector space. Okay. Then definitely there will be a non-zero element, say E1. Okay. Then the singleton set E1 is linearly independent. That is easy, right? Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. Now what we do, okay, you know what is a linear independence. Now we collect all subsets of V which are linearly independent as well as containing E1. So you collect all linearly independent subsets of V which contains E1. Okay. So that is a subcollection of power set. I mean, that's a collection of subsets of V. Okay. Now we give an order here. We give a relation here. That means B1 and B2 in F, B1 related to B2 or B1 related to B2 if B1 is a subset of B2. Okay. So by set inclusion, we can give an order here. This makes it a partially ordered set. That is something we can very easily verify. So you'll verify all these things, right? It's a partially ordered subset, partially ordered set. It is easy, right? Set inclusion, simple set inclusion.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Since it is set inclusion itself, you know that it is need not be a total order, because two sets, you can have two sets. One, neither A is a subset of B nor B is a subset of A. So both of them need not be related, but it's a partial order. Now I want to apply Zone's lemma. So let me check whether the conditions are satisfied. To apply Zone's lemma, I need to prove that every totally ordered subset has an upper bound. So you begin with a totally ordered subset, say F1. So F1 is a totally ordered subset. That means any two elements in F1 are comparable to each other. So if B1 and B2 are in F1, then either B1 contained in B2 or B2 contained in B1. Okay. Now what you do in this for this totally ordered subset F1, you collect all elements in F1 and take the union of all of them. Take the union of all of them. You call it S. My claim is that S is an upper bound for this set F1. So to prove that it's an upper bound, first of all, you need to prove that S is in the collection F, and then we have to prove that S is greater than or equal to all elements here. But that thing is true, S is greater than or equal to all elements here, because S is a union here. Therefore, S contains all the subsets here, all the elements here, and that is the relation here, inclusion. So S is always greater than or equal to all these things here. But the thing is that you need S to be in our collection, in our F. Then only it is an upper bound. Okay. So my claim is that S is in F. That is, we have to show two things. One is that S should be linearly independent. Second is that even contained in S. Even is an element of S. So these are the things which characterizes elements of F. So even will be in S because even belongs to F for all F belongs to F1. Therefore, since the union also contains even. To prove that S is linearly independent, that is also easy. You start from finitely many elements, S1, S2, etc. Sn belongs to S. S1 belongs to, this is in S means it is in the union. Therefore, each of them will be in some of them. Say, Si will be in F1i for some I. But remember that elements in F1s are totally ordered, so they are comparable to each other. So you can list them as a chain. So F1 will be contained in F1 2 or like that. So you can find a larger thing. So what happens is that each S1, X2, etc. Sn will be in some Fm in a unique one. I mean, not unique, in a single one. You can put everything in a single one. Since they are linearly independent, you can easily prove that this is also linearly independent. So, are you okay with the proof? I mean, I just proved that S belongs to F. Are you convinced with that? Very simple. We have finitely many elements in this union. The union element are comparable. So F1 F2 either F1 contained in F2 or F2 contained in F1. That's S1 F1 S1 F1 S2 F2 S1 S2 is that clear to you? I mean, is that clear?
Yes, sir.
Clear, right? Okay. So you can make S1, S2, etc. Sn in a single element here. Therefore, since that is linearly independent, then this will be linearly independent. So we obtained that every totally ordered subset has an upper bound. Therefore, we can apply Zone's lemma. By Zone's lemma, you have a maximal element B, and that maximal element will be your basis. So this claim I leave it to you. I mean, that is easy. If it is not a basis, you can find, means it is already linearly independent because it's an element in F, and it contains even. So if it is if it is not a basis, the only thing is that it cannot span the whole space. So you can find some element which is not in the span, say X. Then B union X will contradict the maximality of B. So that is how to prove that there exists a Hamel basis. Okay. So even though this result tells you that there exists a Hamel basis for every non-zero vector space, it does not tell you how to compute that Hamel basis, and it does not give you any hint about the cardinality of the Hamel basis. In fact, in most of the interesting examples, this Hamel basis is not going to be useful. That's what we are going to see. Okay. So now, so yeah, so these are some basics, basic linear. This is something which is not required. So as far as finite dimensional vector spaces are concerned, Hamel bases are useful because suppose V is a finite dimensional vector space. You can have a Hamel basis, finite Hamel basis. Then what happens? Every x you can write it in a unique way in this way. So you have a linear map here. So this gives you an n-tuple, right? Say alpha 1, alpha 2, etc. alpha n. So this give rise to a map from V to Kn. That is T of x equal to alpha 1, etc. alpha n. But this tells you that this map also preserves linear structure of the space. Therefore, every finite dimensional space can be treated as Kn. A finite dimensional vector space over K can be treated as Kn. That is easy in this way. But when we move to infinite dimensional setting, this is not enough. So that's what we are going to see now. So, any questions so far? Any questions? Please. Any questions? Everything clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, most of the time, the analysis we are doing on the infinite dimensional setting. Okay. So we have seen several examples where we have an algebraic structure of vector space, as well as we have a metric, and in most of these examples, this metric is induced by some function which behaves like an absolute value. So we are going to see that. So in fact, what happens? This gives rise to the notion called norm linear space. So what we have is already we have a vector space structure and a norm on it. Okay, and this norm is something which behaves like an absolute value. Okay, so you start from a linear space. A norm is actually a function from x to r with these three properties. In fact, you can see that all these properties are enjoyed by the absolute value function. Non-negativity, it is 0 only when x equals 0. Because we are in a vector space, so this makes sense. X equals 0 makes sense. And triangle inequality, norm x plus y less than or equal to norm x plus norm y. And this is norm kx equal to mod k into norm x. Okay. And if you have a norm space, as in the case of absolute value, we can define a metric in this way. D of xy equal to norm x minus y. This will give you a metric. Okay. Now, here's a problem. Let me just leave it to you. See, when you have a norm, then that gives you a metric, right? So what happens is that your norm space, all the norm space becomes a metric space. So you can talk about continuity, uniform continuity, and so on. So you treat this norm as a function from x to r, then it's a continuous function with respect to the metric defined in this way. So that is something you can prove. And you can also see other things like xn converges to x and yn converges to x with respect to this metric will imply that xn plus yn converges to x plus y, and kn converges to k will imply that kn into xn will converge to kx. So these are easy because this is an easy consequence of triangle inequality. Because you can simply write norm xn, see, we want to prove that xn plus yn converges to x plus y. That means d of xn plus yn comma x plus y should go to 0. But that is simply norm xn plus yn minus x plus y. So, but you can simply use triangle inequality and obtain that is less than or equal to norm xn minus x plus norm yn minus y. But that is d of xn x and d of yn y. So since xn converges to x and yn converges to y, this will follow very easily. Similarly, you can prove this. So what does it tell you? It tells you that the vector space operation addition and scalar multiplication are continuous operations here. So this gives you the interplay between the algebraic operations on the space and the topological nature. Okay. So now your space has two types of structures. One is the algebraic structure and the other one is the topological structure or the analytical structure. Okay. And here this gives you the interplay between them. Okay. So all of you are clear about what is a norm space. I am going to deal with examples now. Any questions regarding this? Numbers? Any question? Any doubts? Clear? Okay. Now see, now we are in a normed space where you have already a vector space structure as well as a norm, and this norm gives you a metric, okay? And you can check whether the metric is complete or not. Under the metric, we give whether it gives you a complete metric space. If the metric is complete, then we call it as a Banach space, okay? So a Banach space is a complete normed linear space, okay? And the examples, plenty of examples now, because Kn itself is an example, because whatever metric we introduce in Kn, those are coming out of the norm xp equal to summation mod xp power 1 by p, and norm x infinity is mod xi. So the metric, we have already proved that this is a complete metric space with respect to the metric induced by this norm, okay? Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so now LP space, the metric is actually coming from this norm. So LP is also a vector space with this norm, and we have already seen that the metric induced by this norm is complete. So this is a Banach space. So next example for a Banach space. In fact, regarding the first example, you also know that this is a finite dimensional vector space, right? So every finite dimensional norm space will be automatically complete, because just now we have seen in the last lecture note that any finite dimensional vector space can be identified as Kn. They are some linear map, right? So with that identification, since Kn is complete, so the same thing will be true for any finite dimensional vector space, norm space. So this example tells you that all finite dimensional norm spaces are complete with respect to any norm. So they are all Banach spaces. Now LP is a Banach space, L infinity is a Banach space. Now, yeah, this is something I mentioned here. So, yeah, these are the three problems. In fact, I included in the problem sheet. So let me not, maybe I can mention it here. So some inclusion properties of LP. Okay, small LP. So let us simply discuss this problem. I put it in the problem sheet, which will reach you after this lecture. Then now let us look at LP. Okay, so let 1 less than or equal to P strictly less than R. Okay, and finite. Suppose norm xp is less than or equal to 1. What do you mean by that? Summation mod xj power p is less than or equal to 1. Therefore, each xj, absolute value of xj power p will be less than or equal to 1. Do you agree with that? Summation mod xj power p is less than 1. Therefore, each mod xj power p will be less than 1, right?
Yes, sir.
So each term will have absolute value of xj power p less than or equal to 1. Therefore, absolute value of xj will be less than or equal to 1. Therefore, what happens? See, p is less than r. Absolute value of xj power p is less than 1. Therefore, if you means mod xj is less than 1 now. So mod xj is less than 1. Therefore, if you increase the power, say r, that will be also less than 1, right?
Yes.
So what I want to say is mod xj power p will be greater than or equal to mod xj power r, isn't it? Because when you see, once mod xj is less than or equal to 1, when you increase the power, the quantity will be decreasing, right? Isn't it? For example, 1 by 2. So 1 by 2 power 3 ano valudava, 1 by 2 power 2 ano valudava.
1 by 2 power 2.
So നോം എക്സ് പി ആയിരിക്കും എന്താവുക, നോം എക്സ് ആറിനേക്കാളും വലുത്, കാരണം മറ്റേ ക്വാണ്ടിറ്റിയാണ് വലുത്. സോ ഇഫ് യു സം ഇറ്റ് അപ്പ്, യു വിൽ ഒബ്റ്റെയിൻ ദാറ്റ് whenever norm xp is less than or equal to 1, norm xr is also less than 1. Okay, so this will tell you that now in general case, norm xr will be less than or equal to norm xp. That is easy, because now you just need to take any arbitrary x in LP and consider x by norm xp. So that will have norm 1, norm p1. So therefore it will have norm r also less than or equal to 1. So you will obtain this. Okay. I mean, ഇത് ആദ്യം ഇത് assume ചെയ്ത് ഇത് ചെയ്യാം. Then you just simply take an arbitrary x and divide by norm x. Then you will obtain this. Apply this and you will obtain this. So what is the advantage of this? This tells you that norm xr less than or equal to norm xp when p less than r. And it tells you that whenever norm xp is finite, then norm xr is also finite, right? That means whenever something is in LP, then it should be in LR. So p less than r will imply LP contained in LR. Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay. But something more is proved actually. Because of this inequality, you know that if xn and x are in LP, they are all also in LR. So norm xn minus xr will be less than or equal to norm xn minus xp. That means whenever xn converges to x in LP, you will obtain xn converges to x in LR also. Is that okay? Because of this thing. Okay, so that means not merely they are subsets, actually the convergence is also preserved. Okay, so this is actually the topology is also carried as a subspace topology. That's the advantage. So the same thing you can do with L infinity. I leave it to you. And on Kn, you can actually prove that this is why we use this infinity symbol. When norm xp with this same thing on Kn, as p tends to infinity, norm xp converges to norm x infinity. So this is something you can prove. Okay. So now, in fact, you can prove much more than that. So these are all included in the problem session. Now let us see more examples, more sequence spaces. The first one is C. C is a sequence space of all convergent sequences. Of course, it will be already bounded. So you start, means all convergent sequences are bounded, right? So you start from all x in L infinity with xj converges in K, j tends to infinity. So you can see that when xn is a convergent sequence and x2 is a convergent sequence, yn is a convergent sequence, then their sum is also convergent. So this is a subspace of L infinity. And of course, you can inherit the norm there and make it a norm linear space. C0 means you demand something more here. Here you only demand convergence. Here you demand that it should converge to 0. That is also simple that when two sequences are converging to 0, then their sum and scalar multiple will also converge to 0. So it's a subspace. So this gives you another sequence space. And the third one, this is a sequence space in LP where all but finitely many elements of xj's are 0. That means these are sequences. I mean, this will be trivially converge to 0 because there are only finitely many non-zero terms here. But this will not be complete. I mean, this will not be a Banach space. So that you can see very easily. Now you can prove this inclusion, that is easy. Because when C00, what happens C00? Only finitely many non-zero terms are there. Therefore, definitely it will be P summable for any P. And definitely it will be, definitely it will be P summable. Now you take a P summable sequence. Since every convergent series, the nth term goes to 0. That's this result which you know, right? Yes or no? If a series is convergent, the nth term goes to 0. Do you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
So what happens? Every LP element will be, of course, here I missed an inequality inclusion. In fact, P less than R means, P gross means here there will be an inclusion, LR will be here. So every finite P will come here. Then it will be in C0. Now, if it is converging to 0, definitely it is a convergent sequence. So it is a subset here. Now, every convergent sequence is bounded, so it is included here. So this is the way in which you have inclusion here. Okay, and it is your task is to prove that all these inclusions are proper. That means there are bounded sequences which are not convergent. There are convergent sequences which are not converging to 0. There are sequences which converge to 0 but not p-summable. And there are p-summable sequences with infinitely many non-zero terms. So all these things are easily obtainable examples. Okay, are you okay with these examples? Yes or no? Yes or no? Please tell me yes or no.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So, do you have any comments to make regarding this? Now I am moving to function spaces. Okay. So when I move to function spaces, the most important example for Banach space, which we discussed today at the beginning, they are LP spaces. So we have seen that it is complete, right? And it is a vector space, norm space, and norm is obtained by this. Norm Fp is integral mod Fp power 1 by p. And this norm will give rise to the metric, and we have seen that it is complete with respect to the metric. And this is a Banach space, a very important Banach space. Okay, LP. And of course, p equal to infinity also, we have seen that it's a Banach space. Okay. Now, we are going to see the inclusion properties of LP, capital LP, in the situation when measure of E is finite. So this is where I just demand that measure of E should be finite, because when measure of E is infinity, this inclusion will not hold. That I will tell you just now. Now, my claim is that if F is measurable on E, then norm Fp less than or equal to alpha into norm Fr for 1 less than or equal to P less than R finite, and for some alpha greater 0. This is true when measure of E is finite. Let me prove this. Okay, so what is my claim? My claim is that norm Fp is bounded by some scalar into norm Fr and P less than. This is easy actually. Proof is very simple. So I am using Hölder's inequality. Since 1 less than or equal to P less than R, you have R by P greater than 1, right? R by P will be greater than 1. It's a number greater than 1. Now what you do, you treat this as P prime or something, okay? So 1 by this plus 1 by Q equal to 1. I mean, this is a number which is greater than 1. So you have some Q such that 1 by this plus 1 by Q equal to 1. So that is 1 by this means P by R. So take Q in this way, okay? Now we are going to apply Hölder's inequality for this. Hölder's inequality with Q is Q itself. Instead of P, we have this P prime. That means R by P, okay? So Hölder's inequality, where left hand side we had F and G there. Instead of G, we have 1, the constant function 1. Instead of F, we have F itself. So, instead of G, we have 1 itself. Instead of F, we have mod F power P. So it is just like mod Fg, but instead of F, you have this power P. So we apply Hölder's inequality with P replaced by R by P, right? So this power R by P, all power 1 by R by P, that is why P by R. And G is 1, so 1 power Q, all power 1 by Q. This is what you obtain by Hölder's inequality. Since measure of E is finite, you have, this is mu of E power P by Q. Yeah, so we take, this is mu of E by, in fact, I missed it. It is 1 by Q. Okay. This is mu of E power 1 by Q actually. It is 1 by Q. So, however, this is going to be a constant number. So what happens is that norm Fp is bounded by alpha into norm Fr in this way. So this is what we need. So this tells you that whenever norm Fr is finite, norm Fp is finite. So we have the other inclusion. Lr of E is contained in Lp of E when P less than R. So this is simply opposite to small Lp, right? So that is very special about capital Lp. So these are the situations where small Lp and capital Lp differs. And so, okay? And of course, convergence is same. Now in the L infinity case, the same inequality we can derive. Okay? But what happens if measure of E is infinity? When measure of E is infinity, you don't have any inclusion. There may have no inclusion. For example, you take E equal to R. You consider F1t to be 1 by square root of mod t when 0 less than mod t less than 1 and 0 otherwise. And f2t is 0 whenever mod t less than 1 and 1 by t otherwise. Then you can see that f1 is in L1 because you can integrate this 1 by square root of mod t, you can integrate, you will get some number, this, and because it is the bounded interval and this function, even though at 0 it has similarity, it is a square root function. Therefore, you know that the derivative is, it is just like mod t power, it is just like t power minus 1 by 2. So if you integrate it, it will be t power plus 1 by 2 by 1 by 2. So t will come in the numerator, so then it will not have any problem. But this, if you square it, what happens? That will be 1 by mod t. Then you integrate it, you will get log t. And when t goes to 0, log t becomes unbounded. So this f1 is in L1, but it is not in L2 because if you square it, you cannot integrate it. Means integral will not be finite. So f1 is in L1, but not in L2. Or also it is not in L infinity also. f1 is not in L infinity because it is unbounded when t goes to 0. It is essentially not essentially bounded. Now regarding f2, it is 0 within the interval mod t less than 1 and 1 by t otherwise. f2 is actually in L2 because near the neighborhood of 0 it has no problem. Outside that, what happens? 1 by t, you have log t, but log t is bounded there. You have to take 1 to infinity. Yeah. So what happens? It will be log t outside, and log t with the t varying from 1 to infinity and minus 1. So by some cancellation will happen there, and it will not be in, sorry. It will not be in L1. Yes, it will not be in L1 because log t will come and t goes to infinity, it will be diverging. Okay, but if you square it, that's it. If you square it, 1 by t square will come. So log t will not be. So if you don't square it, what happens? It will not be. That is a problem. So it will not be in L1, but it is in L2. That's it. So similarly, constant function is not in, it is in L infinity, but not in any LP. So these examples will tell you that neither, there are elements in L1 which is not in L2, there are elements in L2 which is not in L1 and so on. So anything can happen when measure of E is infinity. So more function spaces. So in fact, I will explain this function space, and this is a very important space. You start from any set T. T is any set, and B of T is all bounded functions on T. Real or complex valued bounded functions on T. And since it is a bounded function, norm f infinity is you can give the sup norm. Okay. Then B of T is a Banach space. This is something I left you to verify. In fact, I used this when I proved the completeness of L infinity also. I used this fact. I mean, you can use it as a next exercise. So B of T is a Banach space. Now, what I want to do is a very interesting thing. Some subspace of this. C of T, all continuous functions on B of T. I mean, all bounded continuous functions. Okay, because already when you say it is in F B of T, it is already continuous. It is already bounded. So you take all continuous functions on bounded continuous functions. C0 of T. C0 of T is all continuous function with a very important property called vanishing at infinity. That means for all epsilon greater than 0, you have a compact set E subset of T such that outside that compact set, its absolute value is less than epsilon. This is known as vanishing at infinity. And CC of T, this is called continuous functions with compact support. That means outside a compact set, it is 0. Okay, its values are supported in a compact set only. Okay, so if T is a compact set, then all of them will coincide. I mean, CCT will be equal to C naught T will be equal to C of T. And what we can see is that this is an abstract definition. When for some special choice of T, you can identify C of T with, I mean, all these things you can identify with the sequence spaces which we introduced, C naught, C0, 0. This can be introduced as C of T can be identified with as convergent sequences. C node can be identified with converging to 0 sequences. This can be identified with finitely many in C00. Okay. Okay, so should I continue or shall I stop here? What do you feel? Any, let me know if you have any questions, please. Yeah. Come on. Any questions?
Clear, sir.
No questions. So are you comfortable with these function spaces? So next thing I am going to do is that I will identify these function spaces with the sequence spaces with some particularity. I mean, maybe I can do it tomorrow. I mean, I think I'll stop here today. So tomorrow I can do that. Or can I continue that? So it is up to you. I can continue maybe